A Flash Outside the Off Stump. Episode 6. Maidan Wicket. One of the most interesting aspects of history is the way that seemingly unconnected events turn out to be entwined in the most unlikely way. The restoration of the monarchy seems to have acted as something of a stimulus in the development of cricket in England, in that it brought about the conditions whereby the rich and powerful became interested in the game, eventually transforming it into one of the defining cornerstones of British life. What is less well known is the connection between the restoration and the emergence of cricket in India. In 1661, the newly crowned Charles II married Catherine of Braganza and received from the Portuguese as part of her dowry the North African port of Tangier and 7 islands just off the western coast of India, which the Portuguese called Bombay. Nearly 200 years later, these two seemingly divergent strands of history came back together in the area of Bombay known as the Maidan. Nowadays, much of the Maidan has disappeared under the colonial architecture that makes up central Mumbai, the university, the High Court and the main railway terminus. But in the early 19th century this was a huge expanse of open space at the southern tip of Bombay's main island. The land had been deliberately cleared by the British in 1772 to allow an open field of fire for the city's defences in the event of an attack by French or Maratha forces, but by the 1820s was largely used for recreational purposes. The British Army referred to the area as the parade ground and used it for this purpose on occasion, but to the rest of the European population it was known as the Esplanade and was a popular meeting place for British and native residents alike. Bombay was probably not the first place the English played cricket in India. We know of a casual game played by the Navy at Cambay in 1721, and that a formal club was established in Calcutta by 1792. But these were exclusively European affairs. Where cricket was played by the British in these early days, natives were definitely excluded, and would be for some time to come. At Bombay, while the soldiers of the garrison played cricket in front of their ladies on the northern end of the Esplanade, much of the rest of the space would be covered in groups of local men playing cards or indulging in native sports such as gilli-danda. This was a game with superficial similarities to cricket, in which a small wooden stick is struck with a longer narrow stick, the object of the game being for the fielders to catch the batsman out. Evidently of great antiquity, it occurs under different names across Asia, the Middle East and the Mediterranean, and was even known in England under the names tipcat or piggy. On the shared space of the Maidan at Bombay, Indians could observe cricket up close, and eventually some came to imitate it, as described here by Shapoorji Sarabji.
Parsi boys began with a mock and farcical imitation of European soldiers and officers playing at Fort George, Bombay, their chimney pot hats serving as wickets and their umbrellas as bats, hitting elliptical balls stuffed with old rags and sewn by veritably unskilled cobblers. Some enthusiastic boys at first only watched from a distance the game played at Fort George, and then hunted after and returned the balls from the field to the players. Such gratis services rendered heartfully and joyfully, the officers sometimes called them to handle the bat, which was done with extreme pleasure and delight.
It is thought that these Parsi boys first started taking an interest in cricket in the 1830s, and it is likely it was these same boys, when they became adults, who were involved in setting up the Oriental Cricket Club in 1848. This was the first time non-Europeans had formed a club, and although it only lasted for 2 years, it was followed by a spate of others. Many of the clubs formed by the Parsis in the middle years of the century were either named after Roman gods, such as Jupiter and Mars, or British statesmen, such as Gladstone and Lord Ripon, and the reason for this lies in how the Parsis saw their identity at the time. The Parsis had migrated to Western India 1200 years earlier, when their Persian homeland had been conquered by Muslims. Settling along the western coast of India, they had adopted Gujarati as their language, but had retained their ancestral religion of Zoroastrianism, along with a strong sense of cultural identity. Being conveniently situated outside of the restrictions of the caste system, and outside of the communal and dynastic tensions between Hindus and Muslims, they had instead concentrated on commerce, and had prospered as merchants, shippers and bankers, with the result that their ranks included a number of very wealthy families. When the British began to become the dominant force in India, the Parsis were quick to place themselves in the position of useful middlemen, and by naming their clubs as they did, they were stressing both their loyalty to Britain and that they had a partially shared culture based on classical antiquity. For their part, the British saw the Parsis as a trustworthy group who could get things done, and although they only represented a tiny fraction of the Indian population as a whole, they quickly became useful mainstays of the Indian civil service and important business partners to the Raj. When the Oriental Cricket Club folded in 1850, it was replaced with the Young Zoroastrians Club, still going strong today. The beginnings of the club were not auspicious. All they could muster by way of equipment was 4 stumps, 2 broken bats and a motley collection of balls which had seen better days. But the position of the Parsi clubs was soon to improve. Community leaders such as Shapaji Sharabji and the wealthy Wadia and Tata families began to sponsor clubs and competitions among the Parsis, and their standards of both equipment and play made rapid strides. However, most were still wearing native costume to play, and this could be problematic. Parsi players wore a long traditional shirt called a sudra, which sometimes got caught up with the bat when they tried to play a drive, and Malalasha Pavri, their most noted early player, was once caught out when the ball was trapped in his sudra. On another occasion, a batsman played a ball which flipped up off his bat into his robes, at which point he was pounced upon by fielders who held him upside down and shook him until the ball dropped out into their waiting hands. English observers were not impressed by native attire on the cricket pitch, Lord Harris complaining that "they look like their shirt tails are blowing in the wind." Meanwhile, the Hindus had taken up cricket in emulation of the Parsis, enabling the latter to disparage their standards of play and costume in much the same manner.
Their kilted garments interfered with running, and they threw the ball when fielding in the same manner as boarding school girls.
Nevertheless, the Parsis persisted in their efforts to master the game, and as they improved began to harbour ambitions of playing against the Europeans, who, not being particularly keen on treating Indians as equals, resisted their requests to play. Eventually, one Parsi club managed to successfully challenge one of the British Army regiments to a game, but the soldiers only agreed on the rather patronising condition that it would be officers with umbrellas versus natives with bats. This was followed by a series of fixtures between the Parsis Mars Club and Union, a club made up of working-class Britons and Anglo-Indians. By this time, the white elite of the city had founded their own sports club, the Bombay Gymkhana, and enclosed approximately a third of the Maidan for their exclusive use. The Gymkhana was not only a whites-only club, it was socially exclusive, being reserved for those of officer rank and members of the professional classes. Members of the other ranks, whites of uncertain pedigree and those of mixed race, were not welcome, and had to content themselves with clubs such as Union. Natives were only allowed into the Gymkhana as servants, although some of these roles could be cricket-related, as Arthur Baggott later recalled.
The technical or thrower was by no means bad praxis. Very straight and very fast, of course, with no break and little variation of either length or pace, but with 6 annas on the wicket apt to be very deadly if you did not play with a straight bat. Beyond that he was useless. Batting with him was an unknown science, and one he did not care to learn. He threw and earned his talab, and there his cricket ended. I have no doubt that over his hubble-bubble he was wont to dilate on the folly of the sahibs to an admiring circle of his fellow countrymen.
By 1877, the standard of Parsi cricket was at last considered worthy of an invitation for a representative 11 to be invited to play the Bombay Gymkhana over 2 days. It seems likely that the Gymkhana's sudden invitation was prompted by a leading Parsi businessman, Sir Khawasgi Jahangir, paying for the furnishing of the club's magnificent pavilion. Although such generosity would still not admit Sir Khawasgi to the ranks of the club members, it would pave the way for some lucrative trade deals. And in the meantime, the Gymkhana was happy to admit Parsi spectators, for 2 days only. In the event, the Parsis performed much better than expected, even leading the match after the first innings, and the Times of India was quick to praise the standards of Parsi fielding. The Bombay Gymkhana triumphed in the end, though albeit by not as large a margin as they had expected. At the after-match dinner, the governor of Bombay, Sir Philip Woodhouse, told the guests that he had no doubt that the Parsis would expect to encounter an All-England 11 within a year or two. In his book, A History of Indian Cricket, writer and broadcaster Mahir Bose dismisses this as an example of cruel English sarcasm, but I'm not so sure. Perhaps Woodhouse was thinking of the English tours that had already taken place in America and Australia, and thinking it wasn't beyond the realms of possibility that one would soon visit India, and that if it did, games against both European and Asian cricketers could be on the itinerary. Whatever his intentions, the Gymkhana extended an invitation for the Parsis to play them again the following year, prompting the London Graphic to run a feature on the advances in native cricket.
In the Bombay Presidency, the Parsis, who have long shown themselves superior to the prejudices with which other Indian races are more or less fettered, have come out quite strong as cricketers. Before long, it is rumoured, a Parsi 11 will visit our shores for the purpose of contending with us on our native turf. We have already received several severe drubbings in the cricket field from our Australian cousins. Perhaps next we are destined to be knocked cricketically into a cocked hat by the descendants of the fire worshippers of Persia.
It appears that the rumours of a Parsi tour to England were briefly quite strong during 1878. Although in the end nothing came of it, and the Aldershot Military Gazette couldn't resist a few Parsi-based puns when the tour was called off. Do you perceive? The visit of the Parsi cricketers has been postponed until next season, in consequence of the leading members of the team having been unable to obtain leave of absence this summer. Persiflage, as the French say apart, the cricketers have every right to appeal against this unworthy persecution by parsimonious employers. If their appeal is disregarded, they must try again, for perseverance conquers difficulties. And back in Bombay, the Parsis, and now the Hindus too, had plenty of difficulties to conquer. The Gymkhana, having already appropriated a large part of the Maidan for their exclusive use, now sought to evict the Indians from the rest of it for 2 days a week, so that it could be made available for polo practice. For their part, the Indians protested, pointing out that not only were so many players already crammed into the remaining space that matches overlapped and interfered with each other, but that the polo ponies' hooves would tear up the ground, making it unsuitable for cricket for the rest of the week. A protracted dispute ensued. The attitude of the polo players and their supporters did not help. They would mark off areas of the Maidan for their play with black flags, but think nothing of riding beyond them at full pelt in pursuit of a polo ball and right through the middle of a native match. Similarly, their supporters would sometimes drive their carriages onto cricket pitches so as to get a better view of the polo field. After a couple of years of this behaviour, Shapoorji Sarabji fired off a letter of complaint to both the Gymkhana and the army. Both refused his request to change the situation. Exasperated, he then organised a petition of native cricketers and went direct to Sir James Fergusson, who had by now replaced Woodhouse as Governor of Bombay. Fergusson forwarded the petition to the army, who once again turned the request down. Undaunted, Sarabji organised a second, less deferential petition, and this time the government conceded that, although they reserved the right to commandeer the Maidan for genuine military purposes when the need arose, polo did not constitute such a purpose, and that the use of the land for civilian cricket should take precedence over polo. The Parsis were ecstatic with this victory, the polo fraternity incandescent. They had been exiled to another area of the Maidan known as the Cooperage, 1.5 miles further to the south. They immediately got up a counter-petition complaining that polo spectators were greatly inconvenienced by this distance. After another 2 years, and the appointment of yet another new governor, the decision once again was reversed in favour of the polo players. While the Gymkhana and the Parsis were in dispute, the annual cricket fixture between them had been suspended. It was reinstated in 1884, but the following year a row erupted over the impartiality of the umpires. The Parsis, feeling that the English were inclined to call their bowling as no balls unfairly, led them to request that they be allowed to appoint one umpire each. The Gymkhana tersely replied that their umpires were gentlemen, and that as home side it was their prerogative to appoint both umpires. Apparently they saw no irony in informing the Parsis that they, the Europeans, were the home team. Frustrated on the umpiring front, the Parsis turned their attention once again to improving the quality of their cricket. In the winter of 1885 they began planning a tour of England for the following summer, and paid for the Surrey professional Robert Henderson to come to Bombay and coach them in preparation. The first Indian cricketers were about to set foot on English soil.